For 6 years, he had been the city's most mysterious garbage collector. He never talked, never smiled, just collected trash. His co-workers called him Skyman because he constantly looked up. But that day, as a military F-16 passed overhead, the pilot who shouted to him saw him and was shocked. "Maverick," he called out. And in that moment, everyone realized that this silent garbage collector was anything but ordinary. Before we continue with this powerful story of hidden aviation expertise and silent service, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet legends walking among us. Metro City Sanitation Department's Route 7 covered 12 miles of suburban neighborhoods, from the affluent hillside developments to the working-class apartment complexes near the industrial district. The route required precision timing, physical endurance, and the kind of methodical attention to detail that kept a complex municipal operation running smoothly. Among the dozen sanitation workers who rotated through Route 7, Jack Sullivan was both the most reliable and the most enigmatic. For 6 years, Jack had been the phantom of the early morning shift. He arrived at the depot before dawn, checked his truck with systematic thoroughness that exceeded departmental requirements, and completed his assigned route with mechanical precision that never varied by more than a few minutes. He worked alone by choice, never requested assistance with heavy loads, and never participated in the informal conversations that helped other workers pass the time during long shifts. The other sanitation workers had developed their own theories about Jack's unusual behavior patterns. Most assumed he was just naturally introverted, perhaps someone who preferred the solitude of driving routes through quiet neighborhoods to the social dynamics of working with a crew. Others thought he might be dealing with personal problems that made casual interaction difficult. But the nickname that stuck, Skyman, reflected the one quirk that everyone noticed but no one understood. Jack had an obsession with looking up, not occasionally, not when something interesting caught his attention, but constantly, systematically, as if he was monitoring airspace for threats that no one else could see. During breaks, while other workers sat and talked, Jack would stand apart and scan the sky with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was tracking specific aircraft movements. When planes passed overhead, commercial airliners, private aircraft, or the occasional military training flight, Jack would pause his work and watch them with an intensity that bordered on the professional. But there were aspects of Jack's behavior that suggested knowledge far beyond civilian curiosity about aviation, if anyone had been paying close enough attention to notice them. His morning routine included a weather assessment that went far beyond checking if it would rain. Jack would study wind patterns, cloud formations, and visibility conditions with the systematic approach of someone trained to evaluate flight conditions rather than simply plan for outdoor work. He seemed to know instinctively when aircraft would alter their approach patterns due to weather conditions, often pointing out planes to co-workers before they became visible or audible to anyone else. His navigation skills exceeded what was necessary for driving familiar routes through city neighborhoods. Jack never used GPS, never consulted maps, and never seemed confused by detours or road construction that sent other drivers searching for alternative routes. He moved through the city with the kind of spatial awareness that suggested training and navigation systems more sophisticated than street-level driving. Most telling was his instinctive understanding of aircraft performance characteristics that extended far beyond civilian aviation knowledge. When military training flights passed over the city, Jack could identify aircraft types, estimate altitude and airspeed, and predict flight paths with accuracy that impressed even aviation enthusiasts among his co-workers. But when asked about his knowledge, Jack's only response was usually a shrug and a return to his work. What none of them knew was that Jack Sullivan had spent 8 years as an F-22 Raptor pilot with the U.S. Air Force's 1st Fighter Wing. He had flown combat missions in 3 different theaters, where split-second decisions in 3-dimensional combat environments had determined the survival of both himself and ground forces depending on air support. His understanding of aviation wasn't academic, it was visceral, developed through hundreds of hours of high-performance flight in circumstances where mechanical failure or pilot error meant death. Jack's transition from fighter pilot to garbage collector hadn't been gradual or planned. A training accident involving engine failure during a night operation had ended his flying career with injuries that disqualified him from further military aviation service. The medical discharge had been inevitable, but the psychological adjustment to life without flight had been devastating. For someone who had spent 8 years thinking in 3 dimensions at supersonic speeds, civilian life felt claustrophobic and artificially constrained. Sanitation work had been a practical choice more than a calling. The job required early morning hours that meant working when most people were still asleep, minimal social interaction, and physical activity that tired his body enough to sleep despite the restlessness that came from being permanently grounded. The irony wasn't lost on him that someone who had once flown at 60,000 feet was now working at ground level, but there was something therapeutic about the routine and the solitude. On the morning everything changed, Jack was following his usual routine along the residential section of Route 7. He had completed the hillside neighborhoods and was working through the apartment complexes near the airport approach corridor when he heard the distinctive sound that made his pulse quicken despite 6 years of forced civilian adjustment. The sound was unmistakable to anyone who had spent years around military aviation, the twin-engine roar of an F-16 Fighting Falcon at low altitude. Jack looked up automatically, his eyes tracking the aircraft's approach path with the kind of professional assessment that had become instinctive during his flying career. The F-16 was flying lower than normal training patterns, following a heading that would take it directly over the neighborhood where Jack was working. As the fighter jet approached, Jack found himself automatically evaluating the pilot's technique, aircraft configuration, and flight characteristics with the critical eye of someone who understood high-performance aviation from the pilot's perspective. The F-16 was flying a demonstration profile, not aggressive combat maneuvering, but precise airshow-style flying that showcased the aircraft's capabilities for civilian audiences. Jack was standing beside his garbage truck, watching the F-16's approach, when something unexpected happened. The pilot, perhaps noticing the lone figure who was tracking the aircraft with obvious professional interest rather than casual civilian curiosity, executed a slight wing dip, the aviator's equivalent of a casual wave. But as the F-16 passed directly overhead, Jack heard something that made his blood freeze. Over the engine noise, barely audible but unmistakable to anyone who knew the sound, came the pilot's voice transmitted through the aircraft's external communication system. Maverick. The call sign hit Jack like physical impact. Maverick had been his pilot designation during his last squadron assignment, a name earned through his aggressive flying style and willingness to take calculated risks that other pilots considered excessive. Only someone who had flown with him, who had shared the brotherhood of high-performance military aviation, would know that call sign and recognize him from aircraft altitude. Jack stood motionless beside his garbage truck, looking up at the F-16 as it continued its flight path toward the military training area outside the city. Around him, other people had stopped to watch the impressive aircraft display, but no one else had heard the pilot's transmission or understood its significance. For several minutes, Jack remained frozen in place, processing implications that went far beyond a chance encounter with military aviation. Someone in that F-16 had recognized him, not just as a former pilot, but specifically as the pilot who had carried the call sign Maverick. That meant the pilot was someone from his own squadron, someone who had known him during his military career and remembered him well enough to identify him from aircraft altitude 6 years after his discharge. The emotional impact was overwhelming. For 6 years, Jack had convinced himself that his identity as a fighter pilot was buried permanently beneath garbage routes and sanitation schedules. But in a single moment, that carefully constructed civilian anonymity had been shattered by someone who remembered him as he had been before the accident, before the medical discharge, before the forced transition to ground-based life. Jack finished his route that day with automatic efficiency, but his mind was entirely focused on processing the encounter. By afternoon, he had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He drove to the regional airport where civilian aircraft were based and spent an hour watching planes take off and land, something he hadn't allowed himself to do since leaving the Air Force. That evening, Jack made a phone call he had been avoiding for 6 years. He contacted the Veterans Administration office that specialized in helping former military pilots transition to civilian aviation careers. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours and ended with Jack agreeing to meet with a counselor who understood the unique challenges faced by grounded military aviators. "I'm not sure I'm ready to fly again," Jack said during the call. "Maybe not," the counselor replied, "but are you ready to stop pretending that flying wasn't the most important part of who you are?" Over the following weeks, Jack began the process of exploring civilian aviation opportunities that could utilize his flight experience without requiring the physical standards that had ended his military career. Flight instruction, aircraft maintenance consulting, and aviation safety analysis were all possibilities for someone with his background and expertise. The work wouldn't be the same as flying F-22 Raptors in combat operations, but it would connect him to the aviation community in ways the sanitation work never could. More importantly, it would allow him to acknowledge his identity as a pilot rather than hiding it beneath civilian occupations that had nothing to do with his real capabilities and experience. 3 months after the F-16 encounter, Jack Sullivan submitted his resignation to the Metro City Sanitation Department and enrolled in a civilian flight instructor certification program. His co-workers were surprised by his sudden career change, but no one was more surprised than Jack himself at how much relief he felt in finally admitting that 6 years of pretending to be someone else had been more exhausting than helpful. On his last day of garbage collection, Jack received an unexpected visitor at the sanitation depot. A man in civilian clothes, wearing aviator sunglasses and carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing, approached Jack's truck as he finished his final route. "Captain Sullivan?" the man said, using Jack's former military rank. Jack recognized him immediately. "Major Tom Rodriguez, who had flown wingman position during some of Jack's most challenging missions. The pilot who had called out his name from the F-16 cockpit, Tom. I wondered if you'd show up eventually. Had to. Couldn't let Maverick disappear into civilian life without making sure you were okay. Rodriguez explained that he had been conducting training flights in the area and had spotted Jack through pure chance during one of his low-altitude passes. Recognizing his former squadron mate had been in shock, but not as much of a shock as learning that one of the Air Force's most skilled fighter pilots was working as a garbage collector. You know, this doesn't have to be permanent, Rodriguez said. There are programs for former military pilots dealing with medical discharges. You could be flying again, maybe not military aircraft, but civilian aviation has opportunities for someone with your experience. I'm working on it, Jack replied. Turns out pretending not to be a pilot is harder than actually being one. As Rodriguez prepared to leave, he handed Jack a business card for a civilian aviation company that specialized in employing former military pilots. They're always looking for people who understand high-performance flight, and they don't care about medical discharges that keep you out of military cockpits. After Rodriguez left, Jack stood in the sanitation depot for the last time, looking up at the sky where he could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines. For 6 years, he had been Skyman, the garbage collector who constantly looked up at aircraft he could no longer fly. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of becoming someone who could look up at aircraft and remember what it felt like to belong in that environment. So I ask you, have you ever encountered someone whose expertise in an ordinary job suggested capabilities far beyond their current circumstances? Someone whose knowledge and skills hinted at backgrounds they couldn't discuss or didn't want to reveal? Share their story in the comments, because sometimes the most extraordinary experience is hidden beneath the most ordinary occupations. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor the quiet professionals who carry specialized knowledge from military service into civilian life, because sometimes the most important skills belong to people whose real qualifications are buried beneath circumstances that don't reflect their true capabilities. And next time you see someone whose competence seems to exceed their current situation, remember that excellence often comes from experience that can't be easily explained or readily displayed in civilian contexts.